Hey guys, tonight we begin with the lacquered doors of the Forbidden City to explore the surprisingly busy and occasionally absurd daily lives of imperial concubines in ancient China. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine being yanked from your silk-covered dreams at the hour when even roosters are reconsidering their life choices. That's how every imperial concubine's day began. Dragged from blissful oblivion by a team of attendants whose job was to make sure you looked divine before you were even conscious. Forget alarm clocks. In the Forbidden City, your wake-up call came in the form of aggressively opened curtains, cold water, and a young maid whispering, "Rise, noble lady," with the enthusiasm of someone deeply invested in your lack of sleep. The other maid? She's already trying to flatten your hair like it personally offended the dynasty. No time for yawning. Yawning was peasant behavior. You had about 7 seconds to go from asleep to ethereal celestial being. Puffy eyes? Offensive? Messy bun? Treason? Drool? Congratulations. You've just given the eunuch something to laugh about until next Tuesday. And why the rush? Oh, not for the emperor. He's probably off playing board games with his ministers and forgetting half your name. No, this was to impress your colleagues. You know, the other 50 women trying to outdress, outpowder, and outsmirk you for the exact same man. And believe me, palace women could smell weakness like sharks, smell blood in the water, only they had better shoes and worse intentions. So there you sat, like a statue sculpted from anxiety and rice flour, while attendants dabbed you into a state of presentability. One applied rouge, another spritzed something floral yet vaguely suspicious behind your ears. You weren't sure if it was perfume or powdered deer antler, and honestly, you were too tired to care. Some concubines learned to sleep sitting upright just to maintain their hairdo. Others bribed their attendants for gentler handling, with mixed results. But all of them knew, if you didn't start the day looking flawless, you might end it in disgrace, or worse, in a slightly smaller room. In the grand scheme of palace life, waking up wasn't just about beginning the day. It was about survival. Silent, powdered, well-lit survival. And if you dared to look tired, well, that was basically a death sentence. For your rank, your influence, and possibly your access to the good snacks. After the brutal trauma of being styled into a silk-wrapped deity before sunrise, it was finally time for breakfast. A reward? Not exactly. Breakfast in the Forbidden City was less comfort meal and more silent social combat over congee. Concubines gathered in elegant silence, arranged by rank, importance, and whichever moon sign the Empress liked that week. The highest-ranking women got to sit closer to the sunlit side of the room, where the dumplings were still warm. The others, well, enjoy your slightly congealed rice porridge and your cold side-eye. Menus were technically luxurious. Lotus seed paste, bird's nest soup, honeyed buns. But you were expected to eat with the dainty enthusiasm of a sparrow on a juice cleanse. No slurping, no chomping. Definitely no burping unless you were ready to apologize to your ancestors in calligraphy. Even the chopsticks had to be held like they were made of glass and shame. Most concubines developed the skill of eating just enough to avoid fainting, but not enough to appear greedy. A full appetite was considered unfeminine. Ravenous? Go meditate. Or sneak some melon seeds under your sleeve and pray no eunuch saw you crunching them behind a pillar. Meanwhile, conversation was an Olympic sport of passive aggression. No one said what they meant. Your hairstyle is very unique today could mean you look like a startled goat, or you're dangerously close to falling out of favor and I'm loving it. Every word was measured, every compliment a booby trap. If you accidentally implied someone's hairpin looked old, you might wake up demoted to chambermaid. The only safe topic? Praising the emperor, excessively, endlessly, loud enough that a spy passing by might report it. His Majesty's poetry is divine, someone would say, despite everyone knowing the emperor's verses sounded like they'd been written by a drunk goose. But that didn't matter. Applause ensued. Performances were everything. Authenticity was stored somewhere in a forgotten teacup, and thus the most important meal of the day passed not with joy, but with the dull tension of a room full of ambitious women, pretending they weren't trying to mentally assassinate each other with every sip of tea. After all, it wasn't just breakfast. It was battle in brocade. Once breakfast was over and the passive-aggressive compliments had settled, the concubines moved into the next segment of their day, existing dramatically, but with purpose. This was known as being seen, a delicate ritual of being visible just enough to stay relevant, but not so visible that people started wondering why you were trying so hard. Subtlety, after all, was a palace blood sport. You didn't go marching through the gardens like a peasant late for cabbage duty. No. You glided. Slowly. Deliberately. With at least 3 layers of brocade trailing behind you like the world's most expensive dust mop. Bonus points if your hairpin caught the light just right and temporarily blinded a lower-ranking concubine. Walking through the inner courtyards was a chance to show off your new embroidered slippers, the ones you weren't technically allowed to wear yet, but you were hoping no one would notice, or at least pretend not to. If a noble lady, accidentally, complimented you in earshot of a eunuch with a big mouth, even better. That compliment would be halfway to the empress before you reached the koi pond. Of course, the real trick was looking relaxed while performing this highly calculated ballet of relevance. Too relaxed, and you looked lazy. Too stiff, and you looked desperate. The sweet spot. Effortless threat. You were not trying to impress anyone. But should the emperor glance in your direction today, well, thank goodness you chose to wear the good jade. And don't forget the accessories. Each fan flick, each slow blink, each barely concealed smirk was a line in your silent performance. One wrong look could spawn 3 weeks of gossip and a full investigation into whether you were secretly mocking Lady Wrong's tragic attempt at an updo. You also had to watch for spies. Not the exciting dagger-in-the-dark kind. No, these were silk-shoed, eyebrow-arching, tea-sipping professional tattletales. They had the Empress's ear and possibly her entire notebook. Smile too wide? You're a flirt. Smile too little? You're plotting something. It was exhausting, but necessary. Because in the Forbidden City, if you weren't being seen, you might as well be invisible. And invisible concubines don't get promotions. They get reassigned to the embroidery room. And no one comes back from the embroidery room. Now that you've been seen, gracefully, mysteriously, and with the correct amount of smug humility, it's time to sharpen your most vital tool, your tongue. Not for biting, for flattering. Because in the imperial palace, sincerity was optional. Flattery, on the other hand, was policy. If you were thinking, I'll just be myself, congratulations, you'd be cleaning the calligraphy brushes by sundown. The successful concubine understood that truth was for scholars. Your job was to admire the emperor's poetry like it had been ghost-written by the heavens themselves, even if it read like a toddler's fever dream. Flattery had rules. It had structure. You couldn't just say, "You look handsome today, Your Majesty." That was the conversational equivalent of handing in a blank exam. No, you needed imagery. Your Majesty's presence today is like the first bloom of plum blossoms after a long winter. There. Now you sound like someone who deserves more hairpins. Of course, you had to flatter the right people too. The Emperor, obviously. But also the Empress, the eunuchs who had influence, and sometimes even your rivals, just to mess with their heads. Nothing says I'm watching you like complimenting Lady Jen's embroidery and watching her spiral into paranoia for a week. But beware, flattery was a double-edged fan. Too little, and you were cold. Too much, and you were fake. Hit that sweet spot where the Emperor thinks you admire him, but doesn't realize you're actively trying to secure next month's Golden Lotus bonus. There were training sessions for this sort of thing. Subtle seminars held over tea, where older concubines passed down the sacred art of looking impressed without rolling your eyes. One flick of the wrist, one graceful sigh, one well-timed, "Oh, Your Majesty," and boom. You've just advanced 2 positions in the invisible ranking system no one talked about, but everyone understood. Sometimes the Emperor wasn't even present, but you praised him anyway. To the birds, the walls, the porcelain vases, because you never knew who was listening, and besides, it never hurt to rehearse. After all, in the imperial court, it wasn't about truth. It was about performance, and the best performers got the best robes, or at the very least the warm dumplings. You flattered the Emperor, survived breakfast politics, and walked the palace grounds like a passive-aggressive wraith in embroidered slippers. Now what? Time for hobbies. Or, as they were known in the Forbidden City, mandatory pastimes designed to stop you from losing your mind or stabbing someone with a hairpin. These were less hobbies in the modern sense, no pottery wheel or sourdough starters, and more ladylike skills you better perfect if you want to avoid boredom-based insanity. Embroidery was a favourite. Imagine stitching tiny golden dragons onto silk for 6 hours straight, while smiling as if you enjoy it. Drop a stitch? Oops, that could be symbolic of your loyalty unravelling. Better start over. Calligraphy was another standard. Not just the act, but the gesture of it. Your strokes had to be delicate yet decisive, like your political moves. Bonus points if you wrote a poem about chrysanthemums and managed to sneak in a subtle insult to your rival. Music? Absolutely. Every concubine worth her salt had to pluck the guccine like a melancholic cloud. The notes had to sound wistful, ideally like you missed the Emperor even though you hadn't seen him in months, and he probably didn't remember your name. If your tune got too cheerful, someone might report you for being suspiciously content. Reading was encouraged, but only certain texts. No scandalous romances, no manuals on political theory, just Confucian classics and moral parables where the women were all either dutiful or dead, sometimes both. You were supposed to read these and then reflect on how you too could become a virtuous footnote in someone else's biography. Some concubines got clever. They turned their hobbies into performance art. A brushstroke that resembled a phoenix. That meant rebirth, as in, I'm rising in favour, Lady Wrong, so enjoy that cold corner of the tea room while you can. It was all in the nuance. Of course, many concubines pretended to enjoy these hobbies more than they did. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Hobbies were just royal waiting rooms with fancier cushions. You weren't creating. You were killing time. Artistically, of course. Because at the end of the day, the best you could do was stay busy, stay graceful, and pray the Emperor got bored enough to come looking for you. After a long morning of artful idleness, flattery, and high-stakes embroidery, the concubines entered the most strategic portion of their day, lunchtime gossip. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just casual chit-chat over dumplings. This was espionage in brocade. Palace gossip was more than entertainment. It was intelligence gathering, social maneuvering, and emotional blackmail disguised as idle curiosity. If someone let slip that Lady Hua was seen crying near the bamboo pavilion, the question wasn't why she was crying. It was, who benefits? Gossip moved faster than the official court memos. Eunuchs, maids, and lower-ranked concubines made excellent couriers. One whispered suspicion in the East Wing could be fully weaponized by tea time in the West Courtyard. If you heard someone say, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," it meant they'd already told 3 other people and were just warming up. The gossip itself was a buffet of scandal: whose hairpin was found in which corridor, who fainted unexpectedly during music practice, and who was looking pale, a delicate euphemism for possibly pregnant, sick, or plotting something nefarious. Sometimes all 3. But gossip wasn't just about others. You had to manage your own narrative. Spread the right rumors about yourself, and suddenly you were mysterious, favored, or deeply poetic. Spread the wrong ones, or worse, none at all, and you became forgettable. Which, in palace terms, was just a polite way of saying next in line for obscurity. Some concubines played the game like masters. They planted false stories just to watch others panic. One concubine reportedly started a rumor about her own exile, just so she could return unexpectedly and bask in the dramatic attention. That's not gossip, that's performance art. But gossip came with risk. If your name appeared in the wrong whisper chain, you could be summoned for questioning faster than you could say, "I swear I was only quoting Lady Ping." Denial only made it worse. The best tactic was wide-eyed innocence paired with subtle retaliation, usually via embroidered metaphors or suspiciously generous compliments. Because in the end, gossip wasn't just survival. It was a test of your memory, your wit, and your ability to smile while someone tried to ruin you over steamed buns. At this point in your daily concubine career, you've flattered, gossiped, and embroidered yourself into a fine spiritual mist. But here comes the real suspense: the evening selection. The emperor's schedule was a closely guarded mystery, known only to a few eunuchs, several diviners, and probably a passing crane. Each day, a lucky concubine would be chosen to serve His Majesty. A phrase that sounds vaguely domestic, but could mean anything from polite tea drinking to, well, ensuring the dynasty continues. Naturally, everyone wanted to be chosen, not because they liked him, most barely remembered what he looked like, but because attention meant power, gifts, maybe even a promotion to a consort, which came with the thrilling perk of slightly warmer rooms in winter. But how did one get chosen? That, dear viewer, was the art. Hair was everything. It had to be immaculate, not one strand out of place unless that place was intentionally out of place to suggest wild yet regal passion. Hairpins weren't decorations, they were declarations. A phoenix pin said fertile and majestic. A lotus bloom said pure but open to suggestions. A jade cicada. Honestly, no one knew what it meant, but Lady Wen wore it once and got summoned twice in 1 week. Timing mattered too. You didn't want to look too available. That screamed desperation. But being hard to find. That risked invisibility. The goal was to appear serenely busy, just as the eunuch passed by. Not rushed, not idle, just coincidentally breathtaking. There were whispers that some ladies bribed the eunuchs to have their names pushed forward. Others fasted for 3 days to look ethereal. One ambitious soul even claimed she saw a shooting star and interpreted it as a divine invitation. She wasn't chosen, but she did start a minor trend. Most evenings ended in disappointment. For every summoned concubine, 10 others smiled politely, removed their dragon earrings, and tried not to look like they were about to scream into a silk pillow. Again. But hope was resilient. Tomorrow, maybe you would be the one. Or not. In the Forbidden City, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a job requirement. Congratulations, you've been selected. The eunuch just gave you the look, the one that says, yes, tonight it's your turn to engage in one of the most awkward job descriptions ever penned in calligraphy. Serving the Son of Heaven was a privilege, a spiritual duty, and for many concubines, a performance review without feedback forms. First, you had to be bathed. Not by yourself, but by court attendants who treated every toe like a political artifact. You were scrubbed, perfumed, and powdered until you looked less like a human and more like a porcelain gift to the empire. Hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about symbolic purity, and also, let's be honest, damage control in an age before deodorant. Then came the wardrobe. You didn't just slip into something comfortable. You were dressed in layers of robes so elaborate that moving your arms became an interpretive dance. Your hair had to be perfect. Your scent, subtle but assertive. Your expression, one of serene readiness, like someone about to host a dinner party they didn't plan. Now, the journey to the Emperor's quarters. You weren't allowed to walk. That would be too dignified. Instead, you were carried on a blanket. Yes, truly. A small group of eunuchs hoisted you up like an awkward, nervous ham and transported you across the palace grounds. It was symbolic. Of what? Submission, grace, and possibly absurd logistics. Once inside the imperial bedchamber, protocol demanded extreme composure. You weren't to speak unless spoken to, no eye contact unless invited, and absolutely no falling asleep before His Majesty did, which could be challenging if the Emperor was the kind of man who wanted to discuss celestial alignments for an hour before getting to business. And the act itself? Let's just say expectations were high and the room cold. Afterwards, you weren't just dismissed. You were catalogued. Palace staff kept meticulous records of which concubine was summoned on which day, not for gossip, but for genealogy. If a baby appeared 9 months later, they needed to know who to give the congratulations you're elevating your family forever sash. So yes, bedroom etiquette wasn't just pillow talk. It was dynasty management with mood lighting. So, you've spent the night in the Emperor's chambers. Congratulations, or condolences, depending on how things went. Either way, the palace wakes early, and so must you, even if your spine is now shaped like a question mark from sleeping on an imperial lacquered platform bed designed more for aesthetics than human vertebrae. The first order of business? Tea. Lots of it. Not because you're particularly thirsty, but because tea gave you something to do with your hands, while every other concubine subtly stared at you like cats at a closed door. You've gone from one of us to that one, at least for today. The tea room was where strategy resumed. You were expected to appear refreshed, glowing, and preferably not limping. Even if His Majesty simply asked about the weather and fell asleep mid-sentence, you had to exude the air of a woman who had personally saved the dynasty. The trick was to smile just enough to be mysterious, but not enough to suggest you were rubbing it in. And while you sipped your tea with practiced detachment, the real court sport began, decoding your appearance. Was your hair slightly tousled? Deliberate or genuine? Did you receive a hairpin gift? Was it gold or just heavily polished bronze? Was there a new bracelet on your wrist? Or worse, a lack of jewelry, which could mean either extreme favor or extreme disappointment? No one asked directly, of course. That would be uncouth. But they all watched. Closely. The concubines weren't the only ones interested. The eunuchs took notes, the Empress's spies took better notes, and the head of the Bureau of Ceremonial Accounting, a real job title, ensured the encounter was logged in the official records, should a baby conveniently arrive in 10 moon cycles. And if you were pregnant? Well, now you were a state asset. But if not, which was statistically likely, the morning after was a return to normalcy. The pedestal was temporary. The glares, however, lasted all week. So you smiled, nodded, accepted a suspicious compliment about your complexion, and prepared for another day of waiting, whispering, and politely trying not to go insane. Once you've spent a night with the Emperor and survived the morning tea gauntlet, congratulations. You're officially a threat. Not to the throne, of course. Just to the delicate egos of 100 other women who have also memorized the Book of Etiquette and know 37 ways to express contempt using only a fan. You see, life in the harem wasn't one long beauty pageant. It was a cold war with rouge. Every concubine had ambitions, family pressures, and a firm belief that she was destined to rise above the rest. Naturally, things got poetic. Literally. Weaponized poetry became the chosen medium of subtle attack. Because why throw hands when you can throw a verse that questions your rival's virtue using flower metaphors? Let's say Lady May started gaining attention. Suddenly there'd be a poem circulating in the courtyards about a withering lotus blooming far too frequently under the moonlight. Subtle. Cruel. And somehow allowed under palace guidelines. These verses were recited casually at tea, embroidered into handkerchiefs, or conveniently forgotten on silk scrolls near important corridors. Public burn, private delivery. No confrontation, just whispers, side eyes, and a shared appreciation for literary backstabbing. Some concubines, especially the more experienced ones, specialized in praise that felt like poison. Your robe is so bold for this lighting. Only someone with true confidence would dare. It's so admirable how you still use rouge from the southern provinces. So vintage. Of course, it wasn't all about words. Gifts were another way to stake your claim. If the emperor gave you a necklace, you wore it everywhere, even during calligraphy practice. If he gave you a rare peach, you casually held it while watching a rival eat a standard pear. And while the Empress rarely descended to this level, she had her own arsenal. Icy nods, last-minute demotions, and the occasional reassignment to a more peaceful palace wing. A euphemism for social exile and boredom. But through it all, the rules remained. No open fighting, no shouting, and absolutely no staining the silks with your tears. Rivalry was an art, and like all palace arts, it had to be beautiful, bloodless, and absolutely devastating. When you live in a palace full of politically motivated women and watchful eunuchs, there are only two acceptable coping mechanisms: embroidery and supernatural paranoia. Unsurprisingly, the latter was more entertaining. The Forbidden City was a swirling vortex of omens, dreams, and celestial warnings. A cat sneezed near the imperial koi pond. That was a sign. Your candle flickered while you were thinking bad thoughts about Lady Shu. That meant the ancestors were judging you. Found a red feather in your rice. Definitely witchcraft. Or a rooster. Either way, ominous. Concubines weren't just women trying to climb the political ladder. They were part-time oracles. Every dream you had was treated like a line from a holy script. Dreamed of rainbows? Good fortune. Dreamed of fire? Danger? Dreamed of the emperor? Well, best to downplay that one unless it came with a lucky number. Of course, nothing got attention like claiming to see a ghost. Ghosts were the palace's favourite gossip topic, second only to whether someone's robe colour clashed with their inner balance. Whispering that you saw a shadowy figure outside your chamber was an excellent way to start a panic, and if you timed it right, delay a rival's tea ceremony indefinitely. The emperor himself was big on omens. Astrology dictated everything from battle strategies to bath schedules. A minor solar eclipse could mean no intimacy for 2 weeks, which, to some concubines, was either a relief or a devastating career setback. And then there were temple visits. Concubines were often sent to pray for the emperor's health, the dynasty's fortune, or, let's be real, for a personal promotion disguised as universal peace. The more incense you offered, the more virtuous you looked. The more dramatic your praying posture, the more likely someone believed your piety wasn't just performative. Some concubines went so far as to cultivate a mystic aura. They'd speak cryptically, gaze meaningfully into lotus ponds, and own disturbingly silent pet birds. It worked surprisingly well. Nothing says, "Don't mess with me," like being the woman who talks to ghosts and once correctly predicted a hailstorm. So yes, spirituality was important, but more importantly, it was useful. Aging gracefully in the imperial harem was less about wisdom and more about slowly becoming part of the wallpaper. Still there, still vaguely respected, but mostly ignored unless someone needed advice on hairpins or which tea reduced bloating. The sad truth? Time was a tyrant, even more so than the emperor. And once your youthful glow dimmed, say around the age of 26, you quietly transitioned from potential mother of heirs to lady of leisure with an uncanny knowledge of embroidery techniques. You didn't get officially fired, of course. This was the palace, not a merchant's stall. Instead, you were elevated to a dignified position in a quiet pavilion with a lovely view of a wall. Promotions in the harem often meant promotions away from relevance. Now, that didn't mean your days were entirely empty. You still had morning rituals, hair to oil, and peach blossom poetry to write with excessive symbolism. But the invitations to the emperor's bedchamber? Fewer and far between, and eventually non-existent. When that day came, the eunuchs would stop including you on the rotation scroll, and you'd pretend not to notice while sipping your chrysanthemum tea with the serenity of someone who'd emotionally checked out 3 dynasties ago. Some elder concubines took this as a blessing. No more scheming, no more rouge-induced migraines, no more worrying about who was sleeping with whom. Others, well, they doubled down on passive-aggressive commentary and became walking cautionary tales for the younger girls. Back in my day, we didn't need jasmine oil to smell divine. We had natural allure and a proper posture. Your new peers, mostly other retired concubines, a few wise old maids, and at least one ex-favourite who now wrote passive-aggressive poetry about longing and revenge. But not all was lost. If you played your cards right, you could become a kind of unofficial harem aunt, the woman the others went to for advice, gossip, or help interpreting cryptic love notes. You were no longer the flame, but perhaps a respected keeper of the ashes. Or at worst, a very quiet, very polite ghost who still got to wear brocade. Being an imperial concubine wasn't all veiled threats and passive-aggressive fan-fluttering. Occasionally, perks fluttered down like petals on a politically manipulated breeze. You just had to know where to look, or at least where to pretend to be looking while eavesdropping. First up, gifts. Oh, the gifts. Silks from the south, porcelain from Jingdezhen, hairpins so sharp they could double as weapons if the need ever arose, and it often almost did. When the emperor was pleased, or merely bored, he'd send elaborate tokens to his favourites. Receiving a swan-embroidered robe? You were in? Receiving nothing? Well, enjoy your tea in obscurity. But here's the trick. It wasn't just about what you got. It was about who saw you get it. Gifts were currency, status symbols, and conversation starters. Oh, this jade pendant. Just something His Majesty had lying around. He said it reminded him of my eyes. Or was it his grandmother's ox? Either way, message received. Then there was gossip, the lifeblood of any well-regulated harem. Information flowed faster than wine during the Lantern Festival. Who coughed in the Emperor's direction? Who was spotted crying near the lotus pond? Who allegedly slipped a love poem under the Emperor's dumpling plate? Truth was optional. Drama was mandatory. Eunuchs, of course, were the unofficial broadcasters of palace news, and concubines who knew how to bribe them with sweets and compliments often got early access to breaking updates. Lady Chen has a rash. You didn't hear it from me, but she did recently visit that questionable apothecary. Then came the real perk. Glimpses of power. Rare, fleeting, and dangerously intoxicating. If a concubine bore a son, she gained leverage. If she bore the son, she became a political axis. Even childless favorites could gain influence if they mastered the art of emotional leverage, timing, and looking tragically beautiful during thunderstorms. Some were granted input on minor court decisions or sent as diplomatic symbols to temples. And while most of it was ceremonial, it still felt good to be consulted about something that wasn't which fragrance to burn in the moonlight. In short, it wasn't exactly ruling China, but it was ruling your corner of the palace, with a fan, a raised brow, and hopefully a slightly nicer room than the other women. For imperial concubines, life was a tea ceremony balanced on a tightrope, beautiful, ceremonial, and one misstep away from a very awkward obituary. Falling out of favour wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it happened with the quiet finality of the emperor not glancing your way for 3 consecutive banquets. One moment you were moon of the 9th hall, the next you were that woman with the cat allergy. The palace had the attention span of a fruit fly on ginseng. Now let's talk poison, the DIY conflict resolution method of choice in the Forbidden City. It was discreet, deniable, and only slightly less subtle than passive-aggressive embroidery. Everything from lotus seeds to facial powder had the potential to end a rivalry, or, at the very least, cause a long bout of mysterious, internal dampness. Some concubines were poisoned slowly, a little tainted tea here, a suspicious cake there, and eventually just stopped showing up to hair-combing ceremonies. Others dropped faster than a eunuch's opinion in a room full of nobles. Accidents were common, slipping on polished floors, falling ill after fish, mysterious nosebleeds. It was almost poetic how predictable it all became. And then there was banishment. Not quite death, but close. If you offended the emperor or outmaneuvered the wrong favorite, you might find yourself relocated to a distant, moss-covered pavilion at the edge of the palace grounds. It was scenic, sure, but so is a prison with nice landscaping. Your attendance would be halved, your gifts would dry up, and your name would vanish from the inner court scrolls like a bad dream nobody wanted to remember. Worse still, getting sent to a temple. Being invited to devote your life to prayer was less a religious promotion and more a socially acceptable form of exile. You'd trade your brocade for plain robes, your intrigue for incense, and your daily flirtations for long discussions about lotus symbolism. But here's the kicker. You were never safe. Even favorites could fall. One missed cue, one misinterpreted dream, one scroll misplaced in the wrong chamber, and suddenly you were just another sad story whispered behind painted screens. So remember, In the palace, beauty fades, but mistakes, they echo. When all was said and embroidered, imperial concubines had one final task: survive long enough to be remembered, or at least misremembered in flattering detail. Legacy in the Forbidden City was a tricky beast. Most concubines faded into the soft golden wallpaper of history, their names lost beneath 1,000 footnotes and the occasional cracked ceramic figurine. But a few? Oh, they lived on, through gossip, legend, and memoirs written suspiciously well for women who allegedly weren't allowed to learn how to write. Take, for example, the genre of harem memoirs. These elegant scrolls, often penned anonymously by ex-concubines, palace attendants, or perhaps just very bored court historians, offered intimate glimpses into the velvet and venom world of the inner court. Except they were less reliable accounts and more dramatized fever dreams sprinkled with truth. Some memoirs spoke of secret romances and midnight strolls under the lanterns. Others detailed elaborate schemes involving poisoned dumplings and cryptic flower arrangements. And while most of it sounded like a cross between a soap opera and a Confucian cautionary tale, the point was clear. Being remembered was the ultimate revenge. Concubines who bore imperial sons had a better shot at legacy, of course. Their names appeared in genealogies, temples, and, if they played their cards right, on the occasional lacquered plaque. Others achieved fame simply by refusing to die quietly. A dramatic scandal, a poetic suicide, or a suspiciously convenient illness. That could land you a place in history faster than 100 silk robes. But sometimes, legacy meant becoming a cautionary tale. Don't be like Lady Lin, who argued with the Empress over a hairpin and ended up in a temple with only one servant and a mild goose allergy. These stories were shared over teacups, whispered through generations, and subtly weaponized by mothers-in-law across dynasties. In the end, for every remembered concubine, there were hundreds more who drifted away like incense smoke, briefly fragrant, quickly forgotten. But if you're hearing this story tonight, perhaps one or two of them succeeded. They slipped through the cracks of silence, flung open the silk curtains of time, and said, "Hey, I existed, and I had opinions." In the early years of the 17th century, Kyoto was still the refined capital of courtly traditions, where poetry readings, tea ceremonies, and the serene stillness of no theatre held cultural dominance. Into this world of dignified restraint walked, or rather danced, a woman who would shake the very foundations of Japanese performance art. Her name was Okuni, a shrine maiden from Izumo, and she was about to create something so wildly different, so colourful, and so provocative that it would scandalize the elite and captivate the masses in equal measure. Okuni began performing along the dry riverbeds of the Kamo River, a spot where commoners and merchants gathered for entertainment. Her dances were nothing like the rigid elegance of No. They were flamboyant, filled with exaggerated gestures, witty dialogue, and an unashamed flirtation with the audience. She wore dazzling costumes, often mixing male and female garments in bold, playful combinations, and she infused her performances with satire, poking fun at priests, warriors, and even the aristocracy. The appeal was immediate. Crowds swelled, drawn not only by the novelty of Okuni's style, but also by the subversive energy she brought to the stage. She recruited other women, many of them from backgrounds that society liked to keep hidden in the shadows: entertainers, courtesans, and women who knew how to command attention. This early form, known as honor kabuki, or women's kabuki, quickly became famous for its sensuality, humor, and irreverence. But in the highly regulated society of the Edo period, where the Tokugawa shogunate sought to control public morality, Such performances didn't sit well with the authorities. The shogunate feared that the mingling of actors and audience, often in ways that extended beyond the performance itself, would disrupt public order and corrupt moral values. And they weren't entirely wrong. Kabuki was as much a social hotspot as it was a theatrical experience. By 1629, the government took the predictable step of banning women from performing altogether, citing immorality. But instead of killing Kabuki, the ban transformed it. Young boys began taking the stage in wakashu kabuki, imitating the women's style with equally elaborate costumes and makeup. This, however, only led to further scandal. But that's a story for the next chapter. In that brief period before the ban, Okuni's kabuki was a revolution, a vivid explosion of color, satire, and theatrical daring in a world that had been content with quiet, ceremonial art. She may not have known it, but she had just set in motion an art form that would define Japanese theater for centuries. When the Tokugawa shogunate banned women from the kabuki stage in 1629, it seemed on paper like a decisive way to curb the immoral energy of Okuni's legacy. In practice, it was like trying to stop a river with a paper fan. The public's appetite for kabuki was already insatiable, and entrepreneurs weren't about to let a little government decree ruin a thriving business. Their solution: replace the actresses with handsome adolescent boys, wakashu, trained to imitate the elegance, flirtation, and charisma of the original female performers. Wakashu kabuki quickly exploded in popularity. These young actors wore the same dazzling costumes, painted their faces with the bold makeup that was becoming a kabuki trademark, and adopted the same exaggerated gestures and coy expressions that had enchanted audiences in Okuni's day. But there was a twist. Their performances often carried a sharper, more playful energy, and their beauty attracted not only female admirers, but also a significant number of male patrons. The result? Kabuki became even more scandalous than before. Theatres turned into social melting pots where samurai, merchants, artisans, and townsfolk mingled in the charged atmosphere. And while the plays were the main attraction, everyone knew there was just as much activity happening behind the stage curtains. The government's worst fears, that Kabuki was blurring the lines between art, seduction, and outright vice, were coming true all over again. The shogunate responded in 1652 with yet another ban, this time on wakashu actors. But instead of killing the art form, it evolved once more. The next phase, Yaro Kabuki, replaced the boys with adult men who would specialize in two distinct roles. Onagata, men who played female characters with stylized grace, and tachiyaku, actors portraying strong male leads. This innovation not only saved kabuki but also gave it one of its most iconic traditions: male actors performing every role on stage, a practice that continues in kabuki today. Still, the wakashu era left its mark. It cemented kabuki's reputation as a theatre of glamour, beauty, and social daring. The bold colours, the intricate costumes, and the charged interactions between performers and audience became permanent fixtures. It also proved something the authorities would never quite learn. Every time they tried to suppress kabuki, they only made it more intriguing. By the end of this turbulent transition, kabuki was no longer just an entertaining diversion. It was a cultural battleground, testing the limits of art, morality, and the shogunate's control. And it was only just getting started. With the wakashu ban in place and adult men now dominating the kabuki stage, the art form entered a phase of reinvention. The most striking development was the rise of the onagata, male actors who specialized in playing female roles. Far from being a clumsy imitation, onagata performance became a highly disciplined craft. These actors studied the subtleties of feminine movement, the tilt of the head, the glide of the feet, and the way a hand might hover over a fan before opening it. Their goal wasn't to convince the audience they were women, but to embody an idealized, stylized vision of femininity, one that existed only in the heightened reality of kabuki. The onagata also transformed costuming and makeup. Layers of silk kimono in vibrant colors were paired with elaborate wigs, some so heavy they required assistance to help the actor move gracefully. Makeup became symbolic rather than realistic. Pale white faces, delicate red accents around the eyes, and subtle hints of pink to suggest youthful beauty. Every choice, from the width of a sleeve to the angle of an eyebrow, carried meaning. Meanwhile, the male leads, or tachiaku, developed their own conventions. They stood firm and projected strength, speaking in bold, rhythmic patterns, often accompanied by dramatic stamping of the feet. The contrast between onagata grace and tachiaku force created the dynamic tension that defined kabuki's theatrical style. This was also the period when kabuki began codifying its gestures and movements into kata, precise, repeatable forms. A turn of the head, a sudden pause, or a freeze-frame pose, at the height of drama, became signals to the audience, telling them exactly when to gasp, cheer, or shower the stage with paper fans in appreciation. These were not natural movements. They were deliberate, stylized, and larger than life, transforming the stage into a world that felt both unreal and emotionally heightened. The Edo period audience didn't want subtle realism. They wanted spectacle, and kabuki delivered. Behind the scenes, the shogunate's censors kept trying to tighten control over scripts, forbidding certain political themes or depictions of contemporary scandals. Yet kabuki playwrights learned to mask their criticism in historical allegories, slipping social commentary past the watchful eye of the authorities. By this stage, kabuki had evolved far beyond Okuni's riverside dances. It was no longer improvised street entertainment. It was a fully fledged art form with rules, traditions, and a style so distinctive that it could not be mistaken for anything else. By the mid-17th century, kabuki had firmly taken root, and the cities of Edo, modern Tokyo, and Osaka became its beating hearts. This was the era when permanent theaters replaced makeshift riverbank stages, transforming kabuki from a wandering spectacle into an established cultural institution. In Edo, massive venues like the Nakamura-za, Ichimura-za, and Morita-za competed fiercely, each trying to outdo the other with grander productions, more famous actors, and ever more elaborate stagecraft. These theaters were not just places to watch a play, they were social events in themselves. A kabuki performance could last the entire day, broken into multiple acts with intermissions long enough for the audience to wander, eat, and gossip. Merchants would rent the best boxes for their families, samurai might quietly slip in despite class restrictions, and street vendors swarmed outside selling snacks, souvenirs, and illustrated woodblock prints of the actors, the celebrity posters of the day. Theatre districts like Edo's Saruwaka-cho became buzzing hubs of commerce and entertainment. Inns, tea houses, and restaurants sprang up around the playhouses, ensuring that a trip to the theatre was as much about socializing and indulgence as it was about art. Actors, especially the most famous onagata and tachiaku, were adored like rock stars. Their likenesses appeared on ukiyo-e prints, and their mannerisms and fashion influenced popular trends. Fans copied the way a beloved actor tied his sash or held his folding fan, just as modern fans might imitate a movie star's hairstyle. Meanwhile, in Osaka, kabuki took on a slightly different flavor. The city was the commercial capital of Japan, and its audiences were known for their refined taste. Osaka productions tended to emphasize intricate plots and emotional depth, developing the wagoto style, softer, more romantic acting, as opposed to Edo's bolder, rougher Aragoto style. This created a cultural rivalry between the two cities, with actors often traveling between them to prove their versatility. Stage technology also began to flourish during this golden age. Revolving stages, trapdoors, and dramatic costume changes, hikanuki, became standard features, keeping audiences constantly surprised. The result was an immersive experience that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. By the late 17th century, Kabuki was no longer just entertainment. It was a central part of urban life in Edo and Osaka. It had its own superstars, fan culture, and thriving commercial ecosystem. For the growing townsman class, Kabuki wasn't simply theatre. It was identity, fashion, and the heartbeat of the city. By the late 17th century, Kabuki acting had split into two distinct performance styles, each shaped by the cultural character of its home city. In Edo, the bustling shogunate capital full of ambitious warriors and merchants on the rise, audiences wanted something big, bold, and brimming with raw energy. This gave birth to Aragoto, literally rough style. Pioneered by the legendary Ichikawa Danjuro Fear, Aragoto was theatre at its most exaggerated. Heroes were larger-than-life figures with booming voices, dramatic stomps and poses, held so fiercely the audience could feel the actor's pulse from the back row. Costumes were massive, layered and brightly coloured, often with symbolic designs like fierce dragons or crashing waves to match the character's temperament. Thick, bold Kumadori makeup transformed actors into living masks, with red lines to signal courage, blue for villainy, and black for supernatural beings. It was kabuki as a living woodblock print, a style meant to shock and awe. Meanwhile, down in Osaka and Kyoto, a different taste was emerging. Merchants there, with their appreciation for refined manners and subtler storytelling, gravitated toward wagoto, the soft style, championed by Sakata Tojuro III. In wagoto, heroes were gentle, romantic, and often flawed, drawn into love affairs, misunderstandings, and moments of vulnerability. The acting emphasized naturalistic movement, softer voices, and emotional nuance rather than sheer spectacle. Costumes were elegant but less ostentatious, and makeup avoided the harsh lines of Aragoto, instead highlighting the actor's own facial features. These two styles reflected more than artistic preference. They mirrored the social character of the cities themselves. Edo's rough, fast-paced energy demanded swagger and heroics, while Osaka's mercantile elegance preferred wit, romance, and emotional resonance. For audiences, the distinction became part of the fun. An Edo theatre-goer might cheer for a roaring Aragoto warrior, while an Osaka fan would sigh over a tragic wagoto lover. Actors often specialized in one style, but the most versatile stars learned to master both, switching cities and adapting their performance to local expectations. This cross-pollination helped kabuki remain fresh and innovative, while also deepening the divide between its two creative capitals. By the turn of the 18th century, Aragoto and wagoto were not just acting styles, they were kabuki's dual identity. Together, they gave the art form a dramatic range that could move an audience to thunderous applause one night and quiet tears the next, ensuring kabuki's appeal across the entire spectrum of Edo period society. Long before modern pop idols and Hollywood heartthrobs, there were kabuki actors. And in the Edo period, they were nothing short of gods among men. These performers weren't just known, they were worshipped. Their fans memorized their roles, copied their fashion, and flooded the theaters to catch even a glimpse of them strutting across the Hanamichi, the famous walkway that sliced through the audience like a catwalk made for dramatic entrances. Actors like Ichikawa Danjuro I, the thundering face of Aragoto, became icons in Edo, while Sakata Tojuro Wai, the romantic master of Wagoto, held court in Osaka. But this wasn't admiration in a polite golf clap sort of way. It was obsession. Fans collected woodblock prints called yakusha-e, glamorous portraits of their favorite stars. These prints were sold by the thousands and plastered across homes and shops like teenage bedroom posters. Some fans even tattooed the names of their favorite actors on their bodies, permanent proof of their devotion. What made Kabuki actors so intoxicating to the public wasn't just their performances, it was the aura. The best of them exuded charisma, mystery, and emotional depth on stage and off. They blurred the lines between their characters and real lives, playing romantic heroes one day and being romantically linked to wealthy patrons or powerful samurai the next. The gossip around them was half the thrill. Some actors leaned into this fame with calculated flair. They staged dramatic retirements only to return in comeback performances. They cultivated signature poses, voice inflections, or makeup styles instantly recognizable across the kabuki world. This wasn't just performance, it was brand building, Edo style. Of course, celebrity came with risks. Rivalries between actors sometimes spilled into actual brawls. Fan clubs, yes, those existed, occasionally clashed over seats or actor loyalty. And scandals were inevitable. Affairs with high-ranking samurai, involvement in illegal gambling rings, or backstage betrayals could ignite public frenzy and government scrutiny. Still, the kabuki actor's status as a public figure was unlike anything else in Edo society. Unlike samurai or nobles, kabuki stars earned their fame through talent, charisma, and sheer theatrical magnetism. They were walking contradictions, adored by the people, distrusted by the authorities, and impossible to ignore. In a society where most people's lives were tightly controlled by class and convention, kabuki actors offered a glimpse into something freer, more glamorous, and undeniably human. They weren't just performers. They were living legends, and the public couldn't get enough. If you thought kabuki actors were just up there for the drama, think again. The visual spectacle was half the thrill. From the moment an actor stepped on stage, every thread of silk and smear of paint carried meaning. In fact, kabuki's visual design was so loud, so symbolic, and so precise that it could practically scream across the room without a single word. Let's start with the costumes. These weren't just clothes. They were walking fireworks. Silk robes in vibrant reds, deep purples, blinding golds. Embroidery so intricate it looked like it was sewn by demigods with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Dragons, cranes, crashing waves and swirling clouds were stitched into garments that weighed as much as a toddler. A single character change could require an entire team backstage performing lightning-fast hikanuki quick changes, yanking off the top layer of clothing in one dramatic swoop to reveal a whole new outfit underneath, right in the middle of the scene. Then came the makeup, known as kumadori. This wasn't subtle contouring. It was war paint. Thick white foundation blanketed the actor's face, with sharp, expressive lines drawn in vivid colors depending on the character's type. Red meant power and virtue. Blue signaled villains, ghosts, or emotional distress. Brown could mean supernatural strength. These designs weren't meant to make the actor look human. They were symbols made flesh. You didn't just see the hero or the demon. You read it on their face like a scroll. And let's not forget the wigs, which could be so elaborate they deserved their own billing. Towering top knots, flowing tresses, or tightly coiled buns, all designed to move with the actor's performance. Certain wigs were engineered for dramatic reveals or transformations, turning a peasant into a princess with one theatrical spin. The stage itself joined in the fun, with trapdoors, rotating platforms, mawari butai, and the dramatic Hanamichi runway that cut through the audience. Kabuki was a 360-degree assault on the senses. The lighting? Natural daylight. No mood lighting here. The actors had to project emotion not just through words but through shape, color, and movement. Every visual element in Kabuki was exaggerated, symbolic, and perfectly calculated. It wasn't realism, it was aesthetic storytelling, where costumes and makeup didn't just support the drama, they were the drama. In an era without CGI, Kabuki pulled off the impossible, turning silk, pigment, and wood into pure magic. Living under the Tokugawa shogunate wasn't exactly a free speech paradise. The government kept a tight grip on public behavior, expression, and especially anything that smelled of political dissent. So, what did Kabuki do? It got clever. Really clever. Kabuki theatre didn't just survive censorship. It thrived under it by mastering the art of implication, metaphor, and historical disguise. The shogunate forbade contemporary political themes, critique of the ruling class, or anything that could stir the pot socially. So, Kabuki playwrights turned to the past, specifically the jidaimono, or period plays, which used historical settings to comment on current issues. It was the Edo-era equivalent of saying, "This totally isn't about the current government, it's about some samurai from 400 years ago. Promise." But the audience wasn't fooled. They knew when a nobleman's betrayal mirrored a recent scandal, or when a villain's cruelty sounded suspiciously like that of a high-ranking official. Another popular workaround was the sewamono, or domestic plays, which tackled the everyday struggles of common people. Lovers torn apart by social obligations, merchants facing corrupt officials, samurai losing their honor. These weren't explicitly political, but they poked holes in the social structure by highlighting its injustices, hypocrisies, and moral contradictions. The audience could see themselves on stage, and they could laugh, cry, or rage in recognition. Even the onagata became part of the subversion. These male actors, playing idealized female characters, often presented women as the emotional and moral heart of the story. At a time when real women were excluded from the stage, and often legally silenced, Kabuki gave them voice and complexity through artifice. Was it satire? Empowerment? Both? Probably. Censorship also influenced language and symbolism. Certain phrases, gestures, or costume choices became coded messages. A cherry blossom might symbolize fleeting beauty, or the sudden fall of a public figure. A subtle change in color could signal a character's betrayal. It was a layered system, and savvy audiences knew how to read between the lines. Government censors attended shows, sometimes in disguise, but Kabuki's brilliance was in giving them just enough plausible deniability. On the surface, it was all dancing and drama. Underneath, it was a mirror, sharp, defiant, and deeply aware. In this dance between art and authority, Kabuki emerged not as a victim of censorship, but as its most creative adversary. It didn't just play by the rules, it rewrote them. As the Edo period drew to a close in the 19th century, Kabuki stood tall as a cultural giant, a living chronicle of Japan's urban heart, its struggles, its laughter, and its contradictions. But it wasn't content with being a relic. Kabuki endured, transformed, and eventually earned a place not just in the hearts of Edo's city dwellers, but in Japan's national identity. After centuries of innovation, scandal, censorship, and reinvention, Kabuki had developed a complex grammar all its own, a language of movement, makeup, costume, and music that defied easy imitation. When Japan opened to the West during the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, Some elites tried to push Kabuki aside in favor of modern Western-style theater. But Kabuki didn't flinch. Instead, it dug in its heels, doubled down on tradition, and proved itself resilient, refusing to be replaced by powdered wigs and violin solos. Actors became cultural ambassadors. Iconic families like the Ichikawa and Nakamura dynasties continued to pass down roles through generations, keeping Kabuki's legacy alive. Lineage mattered. A modern Ichikawa Danjuro wasn't just playing a role, he was inheriting centuries of theatrical DNA. Each performance wasn't just theatre, it was ritual, continuity, and homage. Meanwhile, efforts to preserve Kabuki intensified. Classic scripts were archived, training schools were established, stage techniques were refined and systematized. By the 20th century, Kabuki had not only survived modernization, it had been enshrined. The Japanese government designated it an important, intangible cultural property, and UNESCO eventually recognized it as part of the world's intangible cultural heritage. But don't mistake preservation for stagnation. Modern Kabuki actors continued to reinterpret roles, adjust pacing, and explore new ways to connect with contemporary audiences, all while staying true to the form. Some productions added modern lighting, sound effects, or multimedia projections, blending old and new in ways that Okuni herself might have found delightfully rebellious. Today, whether performed in the Grand Kabuki-za in Tokyo or adapted for a school stage in a rural town, Kabuki still casts its spell. It reminds Japan, and the world, that theatre isn't just entertainment. It's memory. It's identity. It's a centuries-old dialogue between past and present, spoken in silk, pigment, and thunderous applause. And somewhere, in the echo of a mai pose and the stomp of a wooden gaiter, Okuni is probably smiling. Long before matadors in glittering suits strutted across sandy arenas, long before the roar of a Spanish crowd met the stomp of an angry bull, there were the Romans. When they conquered the Iberian Peninsula and turned it into the province of Hispania, they brought with them more than just aqueducts, togas, and Latin grammar. They brought the theatre of blood. Roman public games, particularly the Venaciones, exhibitions of man versus beast, were the ancient world's version of primetime entertainment. In these spectacles, wild animals such as lions, bears, and, yes, bulls, were pitted against trained fighters, or occasionally left to rampage for the amusement of the masses. Hispania, with its rugged terrain and abundance of bulls, proved the perfect setting. Amphitheaters were constructed, crowds gathered, and bulls began their journey from sacred beasts of the Iberian past to symbols of controlled chaos and raw spectacle. But when the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, its polished arenas began to crumble, and with them, the formal structure of Roman games. Still, the idea of facing a bull, of challenging brute strength with human courage, didn't disappear. It simply went underground. What had once been a ticketed event for the upper classes slowly transformed into a rural tradition, woven into local festivals and seasonal rituals. Farmers, villagers, and wandering performers kept the concept alive in small, brutal, unsanctioned ways. Over time, these rustic echoes of Roman entertainment evolved into cultural fixtures in medieval Spain. While no longer called Venaciones, the essence of spectacle remained. The idea of man versus animal, framed not just as combat, but as art, a struggle watched by the many, often ending in glory or gore. It wasn't yet the bullfight we know today. There were no matadors in gold embroidery, no embroidered capes twirling under the sun. But the DNA of bullfighting, the blending of performance, danger, and public obsession, had already taken root. The Roman passion for drama hadn't died with the empire. It had simply taken off its helmet, grabbed a red cloth, and waited quietly for the Middle Ages to give it a new name. And in the dirt of Roman ruins, among the ghosts of gladiators and the bulls they faced, a uniquely Spanish tradition was beginning to stir. In the year 711, North African Muslim armies crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began a conquest that would change the cultural DNA of the Iberian Peninsula forever. They brought science, architecture, poetry, and an obsession with horses. While the Moors didn't invent bullfighting, they added an essential ingredient to its medieval evolution: refinement. Theirs was a world of controlled elegance, where the art of the rider was just as important as the thrill of the charge. Under Moorish rule, equestrian skill became a mark of nobility. The caliphs and emirs of Al-Andalus hosted public exhibitions where riders would demonstrate furusiya, a code of mounted warfare and chivalry that emphasized agility, posture, and precision. These performances often involved hunting displays with wild game, showing off not just military training, but theatrical flair. The horse was not just a tool, it was a dance partner, and the rider was a performer as much as a warrior. Now enter the bull. Although the Moors revered bulls in some poetic contexts, they were far more interested in showing dominance over animals rather than killing them for sport. In early Moorish Iberia, there are scattered references to horseback contests involving bulls. Not gory bloodbaths, but ritualized displays of bravery and control. Think of a nobleman circling a bull at high speed, demonstrating balance and mastery, not stabbing, but showcasing his command over chaos. These early contests were not yet bullfighting in the modern sense. They were tests of horsemanship, evolving from military drills into half sport, half theatre. But crucially, they planted the seeds for what would later become the regioneo, the horseback form of bullfighting still practiced today. Even more significantly, these events were public. Crowds gathered to watch nobles flaunt their daring, their wealth, and their perfectly trained Andalusian horses. The line between military training and public entertainment began to blur. As the centuries passed, these courtly exhibitions started slipping into local tradition, spreading to festivals and town celebrations. By the time Christian knights began reclaiming the peninsula during the Reconquista, they didn't just fight to take back land, they absorbed the Moorish obsession with elegant equestrianism. The result was a cultural fusion: Roman spectacle, Moorish grace, and soon, Christian pageantry. Together, they began shaping a new kind of performance, one that would eventually put both man and bull center stage. And the horse? It would remain the quiet, thundering heartbeat of the arena. As Christian kingdoms gradually reclaimed the Iberian Peninsula during the centuries-long Reconquista, they weren't just waging holy war against the Moors. They were inheriting, adapting, and transforming centuries of cultural fusion. And nowhere was this more flamboyantly displayed than in the evolving spectacle of the bullfight. Christian knights, fresh from the battlefield and eager to flaunt their valor during peacetime, turned to tournaments. These public events allowed nobles to parade their horsemanship, weapon skills, and bravado. But while jousting was popular in northern Europe, Spain was already brewing something distinct. Bullfighting, or rather bull challenging, began to take center stage. In this period, the practice was known as toreo a caballo, bullfighting on horseback. Drawing from both the Roman traditions of spectacle and the Moorish obsession with equestrian control, Christian nobles began staging daring displays where they would charge bulls with lances in front of cheering crowds. It wasn't just entertainment, it was propaganda. A knight controlling a furious bull symbolized the victory of Christian order over pagan chaos. Or, depending on how dramatic you were feeling, the triumph of God over the devil. These events were tied to religious festivals, coronations, military victories, and other state occasions. They were pageants, filled with banners, trumpets, and richly adorned armor. The bull became more than just an animal. It was a dramatic foil, a living metaphor for danger, nature, and the challenges of life itself. Unlike the stylized matador fights of later centuries, these medieval contests were raw. There were no professional toreros yet. Participants were aristocrats, knights, and military elites, many of whom saw it as a personal rite of courage. Injuries were common. Deaths happened. But backing down in front of a bull meant losing honor. And in medieval Spain, you'd sooner lose a limb than your reputation. These noble bullfighters didn't just inspire awe, they inspired imitation. Across Spain, local festivals began including amateur versions of these contests. Young men from farming villages, emboldened by wine and testosterone, would try to emulate their lords by taunting or dodging bulls. Thus, the spectacle began to trickle downward, from royal courts to town squares. By the late Middle Ages, the bullfight had become a two-headed tradition, noble sport on horseback and popular daredevilry on foot. Both were growing, evolving, and setting the stage for the next dramatic transformation, when the matador would finally arrive. By the late Middle Ages, bullfighting was no longer reserved for silk-clad nobles under royal banners. It had begun to seep into the fabric of everyday Spanish life, trickling from palaces into plazas. What began as a demonstration of aristocratic skill evolved into a grassroots ritual, rowdy, dangerous, and proudly local. In towns and villages across medieval Spain, bull festivities became regular features of religious festivals, harvest feasts, and saint days. Unlike the elegant displays of the noble class, these events were chaotic, unpredictable, and often wildly improvised. Bulls were released into cobbled streets or crude arenas, and young men, often with no formal training and far too much pride, would charge, leap, taunt, or try not to die. This was the beginning of bullfighting on foot. There were no lances, no armor, no horses. Just speed, nerve, and whatever cloth you could wave in front of a charging beast. These amateur toreros weren't looking for applause. They were looking for status. A successful close pass, a daring sidestep, or a wild jump over the horns could win the cheers of a crowd and the whispered admiration of the local girls. But it wasn't all wine and bravado. Towns began to recognize the draw of these events. Local leaders constructed wooden barricades, elevated viewing stands, and rudimentary rings. Bull runs, encierros, became traditions, some of which still survive today, like the famed San Fermin festival in Pamplona. Even as they remained spontaneous, these events began to take on structure. Roles were defined. Rules, loose though they were, started to emerge. Crucially, the absence of horses changed everything. A man facing a bull on foot required a different set of skills: agility over force, rhythm over brute strength, performance over power. And with that shift, something new entered the tradition: a theatrical flair. Movements became stylized, costumes became brighter. The crowd wasn't just watching a contest, they were watching a show. This evolution sparked something vital: the professionalization of the bullfighter. As crowds grew and reputations were made, certain men became known not just for bravery, but for grace. They didn't just survive the bull, they danced with it. The night was fading from center stage. In his place rose a new figure, still courageous, still showy, but grounded, flamboyant, and born from the streets. The seeds of the modern matador had been planted. In medieval Spain, The bull was more than a beast. It was a symbol woven into the spiritual and ceremonial rhythm of life. Bullfighting, as it developed during this period, didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a larger tapestry of religious festivals, civic rituals, and public celebration. And if there's one thing medieval Spaniards knew how to do, it was throw a dramatic, God-fearing party. Almost every town had a patron saint, and almost every patron saint had a feast day. These celebrations often included processions, dances, food, music, and of course bulls. The Fiesta Taurina was less a scheduled event and more an explosion of ritual energy, blending the sacred and the profane into one thundering celebration. Churches blessed the bulls, priests marched in procession, and then, just hours later, local men would be hurling themselves across a dusty square in front of that very same holy animal. It was theatre, yes, but also devotion. The bull, powerful and uncontrollable, came to represent sin, temptation, or even the devil himself. To stand before it was a test of courage, masculinity, and faith. If you survived, you were admired. If you died, well, at least it was in public and with style. The town square became the centre of the action. Temporary wooden arenas were constructed right in the middle of cities, often in front of churches or municipal buildings. Balconies became box seats. Tavern rooftops turned into VIP sections. Local nobles watched from above while commoners gathered in the dust, leaning on fences that might or might not hold when the bull got too close. This festival energy also elevated the bull itself. These animals weren't just props. They were bred, trained, and paraded with ceremony. Trumpets would sound, flags would fly. The crowd would hush as the gate opened, and out came the beast, not as a victim, but as a mythic opponent. Each performance, whether bloody, farcical, or breathtaking, became part of a town's identity. Bull festivals were stories told in motion, repeated year after year, building local legends and neighborhood pride. And as the centuries rolled on, the festival bullfight moved from chaos to choreography. A new rhythm was emerging. The street-level bravery of local heroes began to morph into something more structured, more performative, less a brawl and more a ballet. The bullfight was becoming art. By the late Middle Ages, something remarkable had happened. Bullfighting was no longer just a noble pastime or a village dare. It was evolving into a profession. And with that evolution came a new kind of figure. Not a knight in shining armor or a drunken farmhand in a linen shirt, but a trained performer, a showman, a craftsman of courage. The torero was born. The rise of professional bullfighters didn't happen overnight. It began with reputation. Certain individuals, often from humble origins, started to gain local fame for their consistent ability to face bulls on foot with elegance and control. These weren't reckless fools. They were tacticians. They understood the bull's rhythm, its tells, its patterns. They developed specific techniques, dodges, passes, feints, and gave names to each one. What was once chaos was becoming choreography. The torero wasn't just there to survive, he was there to impress. Style mattered. The way you moved, the angle of your approach, the timing of your steps, all of it became part of a growing code. And the more recognizable these techniques became, the more audiences began to expect and demand them. In short, the crowd was no longer content with luck and blood. They wanted drama. They wanted flair. They wanted technique. It was during this time that we also see the first inklings of specialized training. Young men aspiring to enter the ring would apprentice under seasoned fighters. They'd learn the craft, practice the footwork, and study the psychology of the bull. The art was becoming generational, passed down, refined and preserved like a guild trade. This shift also meant a change in attire. Gone were the rough village clothes or the flashy armor of knights. Early toreros began wearing more flamboyant costumes, influenced by both courtly fashion and theatrical design. Color and contrast became key, not only for spectacle, but also so every movement could be seen clearly from the crowd. Clothing, like movement, became part of the performance. The torero represented something new in Spanish society, the commoner elevated by skill, not bloodline. He was a man of the people, but with a touch of the divine, capable of facing death not with brute strength but with artistry. And as this figure began to take over the arena, the very identity of the bullfight shifted, from ritual and brawl to a staged duel of grace, danger, and rising fame. While the spotlight increasingly turned toward the torero, there was another equally critical figure in this evolving medieval tradition: the bull itself. Not just any beast would do. As bullfighting grew from scattered village events to a structured, symbolic art form, the bulls had to evolve with it. That meant one thing: breeding. Selective, calculated, and deadly serious breeding. By the late medieval period, certain regions of Spain, particularly Andalusia, became known for producing bulls of exceptional size, aggression, and stamina. These animals weren't accidental champions. Breeders began focusing on specific traits: wide horns, powerful frames, and most importantly, a noble ferocity. The ideal bull didn't just charge, it performed. It moved with purpose, responded to the cape, and displayed a kind of brutal intelligence. A bull that simply ran in circles was a bore. A bull that fought back, read the matador's movements, and adapted in the arena. That was the real prize. Families began to develop bull ranches, precursors to the great ganaderias that still dominate Spanish bullfighting today. These were multi-generational efforts, with bulls raised from calves under strict supervision, their temperaments observed and tested. Not all were selected for the ring. Only the most spirited, and potentially lethal, made the final cut. Ironically, these bulls lived better than many peasants. They roamed large estates, were well fed, and kept in near wild conditions to preserve their strength and instincts. The contradiction was poetic, a life of peace and comfort, leading to a violent, theatrical death. Breeders weren't just supplying animals, they were shaping the very identity of the bullfight. The unpredictability of the bull was part of the drama, but within boundaries. A good bull needed to be dangerous, yes, but also predictable enough for the torero to perform with grace. This balance between chaos and choreography was at the heart of the spectacle. Over time, certain bull bloodlines became famous. A ranch's reputation could rise or fall based on the performance of a single bull. Just as audiences cheered for star matadors, they began to recognize names of toros bravos, brave bulls who had earned their own kind of fame in the sand. In the growing arena of medieval Spain, the bull was no longer a mere beast. It was a character, a villain, a hero, a test of fate bred in pasture lands under the weight of centuries-old bloodlines, and destined to die beneath a flourish of cloth and applause. As the bullfight grew more organized, symbolic, and spectacular, it needed a proper home. Makeshift wooden fences and town squares weren't going to cut it forever. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, Spain began building purpose-designed bull rings, plazas de toros, architectural spaces crafted not just for safety, but for theatrical grandeur. And with that, the bullfight officially moved from folk tradition to national stage. The earliest bull rings were still temporary, circular enclosures built for a festival and then dismantled. But as the events became more frequent and prestigious, permanent structures began to appear. One of the earliest documented was in Zaragoza, followed by others in Seville and Madrid. These were circular arenas inspired by Roman amphitheatres, with tiered seating that allowed thousands of spectators to witness every movement in the sand. The shape of the ring wasn't accidental. The circle allowed the bull to move freely without corners to hide in, and gave the torero full space to perform the faena, the series of passes that would define the art of bullfighting for centuries. The architecture served the drama, wide enough for spectacle, enclosed enough for intimacy, and always built so that the action remained the visual and emotional centre. Each ring developed its own rituals. Some had royal boxes, where kings and nobles could preside over the event. Others had musical ensembles that signalled different moments in the fight. Flags were raised, drums pounded, trumpets announced the entrance of the bull. It was more opera than sport. Importantly, the rise of the bull ring also shifted the expectations of the audience. No longer were they just witnessing a battle. They were attending a performance. As the seating became structured, so did the event itself. The fight was divided into clear stages, with formalized rules, time limits, and choreography. This standardization turned bullfighting into something larger than life, a national ritual enacted across the country, from grand cities to small villages. The Plaza de Toros was more than a building. It was a crucible. Within its walls, centuries of tradition, myth, and raw adrenaline collided. And as these arenas grew in scale and prestige, they elevated the bullfight from provincial entertainment to a defining expression of Spanish identity. A stage where history, culture, and death danced in perfect, dusty symmetry. By the end of the medieval period, bullfighting was no longer just a pastime. It had become a cultural cornerstone, deeply embedded in the Spanish imagination. What began as scattered rituals, nightly games, and village chaos had transformed into a stylized, ritualized spectacle with clear rules, recognized heroes, and a devoted following. The medieval bullfight left behind more than blood in the sand. It left a blueprint for national identity. The tradition had now absorbed elements from every chapter of Iberian history. From the Romans came the love of the arena and the structure of public performance. From the Moors, the obsession with control, grace, and the aesthetics of confrontation. From the Christian knights, a flair for pageantry, honor, and public bravery. And from the common people came raw emotion, improvisation, and a flair for survival without armor. Together, these forces created a tradition that blurred the lines between ritual, theater, and combat. Bullfighting became more than entertainment. It was seen as a reflection of the Spanish soul, proud, fatalistic, passionate, and unwilling to turn away from the face of death. By the early Renaissance, bullfighting had moved into the hands of professionals. The medieval knight had hung up his lance, and in his place stood the matador, capes swirling, feet planted, eyes locked with the charging beast. The spectacle had become codified. Roles were defined, stages formalized, and the language of the ring was now as structured as a religious ceremony. But even as the centuries turned, the echoes of medieval Spain remained. The bull still entered to fanfare. The crowd still roared as a man faced death in full view of his peers. The plazas still filled with thousands who knew that what they were watching wasn't a sport. Not exactly. It was a ritual, passed down from generation to generation, with roots deeper than most dared imagine. The legacy of medieval bullfighting isn't just visible in costumes or choreography. It's in the attitude. A defiant refusal to look away from danger, a commitment to style in the face of death, and a belief that courage isn't just physical, but artistic. And for better or worse, it's a legacy that still steps into the ring, every time the trumpet sounds and the gates swing open. In medieval Ireland, if a weary traveller knocked on your door, you didn't pause to ask who they were, where they came from, or what they wanted. You opened it. Because in ancient Gaelic society, hospitality wasn't just a virtue, it was a legal obligation backed by one of the oldest legal systems in Europe, the Brehon laws. This wasn't some warm, fuzzy Celtic courtesy. This was serious business. According to the Brehon legal code, every free person was bound to offer food, shelter, and basic protection to guests, especially travellers or strangers. Refusing hospitality wasn't just rude, it was a violation of the law and could lead to fines, loss of status, or public disgrace. A guest under your roof was considered sacred, and for the duration of their stay, you were responsible for their well-being. If they were harmed, insulted, or even made uncomfortable, the blame fell on the host. This emphasis on hospitality was deeply entwined with the structure of Irish society at the time. A decentralised landscape of clans, chiefs, poets, and farmers spread across the hills, valleys, and bogs of early medieval Ireland. There were no state-run inns or royal patrols on lonely roads. Travel was dangerous, shelter was rare. The only thing that kept the wheels of society turning, beyond kinship ties, was mutual obligation. Today's guest could be tomorrow's protector, or bard, or judge. But it wasn't only about safety, it was about honour. In a culture where reputation was currency, how you treated guests mattered. A generous host earned praise, prestige, and spiritual reward. A stingy one earned mockery, fines, or worse, a satirical poem from a bard that could destroy your reputation faster than a sword ever could. Hospitality became a kind of social performance, a ritual of food, warmth, and welcome that said, "You are under my roof. I will care for you. I will." Even fugitive outlaws and travelling poets were sometimes protected under these rules. Refusing shelter to someone who invoked the law of hospitality could mean a breakdown in social cohesion. The guest was not just a visitor. They were a temporary member of your household, placed there by the will of fate and shielded by the full weight of tradition. So yes, in medieval Ireland, you welcomed the stranger, or else. To understand why hospitality was so sacred in medieval Ireland, you have to understand the system that enforced it, the Brehon laws. These weren't dusty statutes handed down from kings or enforced by sword-wielding sheriffs. The Brehon laws were a living, breathing network of customary codes passed down orally and refined over centuries, rooted in fairness, reciprocity, and a shocking amount of detail about things like how to feed guests, where they could sleep, and what to do if someone stole a pig. Named after the Brehons, professional jurists who memorized the laws and acted as mediators, judges, and walking encyclopedias, this legal system functioned without a centralized monarchy or standing army. Ireland wasn't a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of clans, each with its own chieftain, warriors, and farmers. The law was what held it all together, and hospitality was one of its cornerstone expectations. The Brehon Code didn't just recommend hospitality, it enforced it. Entire legal tracts outlined the responsibilities of hosts and the rights of guests. There were laws governing how long a guest could stay, typically 3 nights, what kind of food and bedding should be provided depending on the host's status, and what to do if a guest insulted their host or overstayed their welcome. There was even a legal term for an unlawful guest, airfortail, someone who abused the rights of hospitality and could be expelled or fined. Why such meticulous attention to house guests? Because in a society without hotels, postal systems, or highways, travellers were vulnerable. A travelling poet, messenger, or monk had to rely on the goodwill of strangers. If one clan started refusing travelers, it disrupted trade, news, and the sacred flow of cultural exchange. Hospitality wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. The Brehons, often attached to noble households or monasteries, didn't just recite laws. They interpreted them, adapted them to context, and ensured they were followed. Their rulings weren't enforced with prisons. Shame and honor were the currency. A host who violated the rules of hospitality could be publicly disgraced, fined livestock, or barred from making future legal claims. So while modern law might care more about contracts and codes, medieval Ireland's legal heart beat to the rhythm of something much older. The idea that every person deserved a welcome, a warm meal, and a roof over their head, because society itself depended on it. Not all guests were created equal in medieval Ireland, but nearly every traveller had some kind of right to hospitality. The Brehon laws were surprisingly inclusive for their time, outlining not just the duties of hosts, but the categories of people who could legally expect shelter, food, and safety. From noble envoys to wandering bards, the Irish hearth had room for more than just friends and neighbours. At the top of the list were Aicmafine, members of one's own kin group. If a cousin 3 times removed showed up at your door dripping from the rain and demanding stew, you were legally obligated to let him in. But kinship wasn't the only passport. Travelling poets known as fillid enjoyed near-religious status. Refusing them food or lodging could result in a devastating satirical poem, which in Irish society was considered worse than physical punishment. The satire, or air, was believed to have magical, even legal weight. An insult from a bard could ruin your honour and your standing in the community. Then there were monks and clerics, who represented not only spiritual authority, but often served as record keepers, scholars, and political intermediaries. They too were welcomed as sacred guests, often receiving better accommodations than the average farmer. Refusing them wasn't just socially frowned upon. It could invite church penalties, which in a deeply spiritual society carried serious weight. Interestingly, even criminals and fugitives were not entirely outside the system. If a person was being pursued and managed to invoke the law of hospitality before entering someone's home, the host was legally bound to protect them, at least temporarily. Once inside, they became a senclaith, a guest under the host's protection. It didn't matter what crimes they may have committed, while under your roof, they were untouchable. Violating this sacred trust could result in a heavy fine or blood feud. Of course, guests had responsibilities too. They were expected to behave respectfully, refrain from theft or insults, and leave after a reasonable stay, usually 3 nights, unless explicitly invited longer. Overstaying could downgrade you from honoured guest to unlawful squatter, which came with its own set of legal consequences. In essence, hospitality wasn't about kindness, it was a contract. The guest received shelter and food, the host earned honour and legal protection, and society at large kept its wheels turning. And in a world without locks, hotels, or Yelp reviews, that delicate balance was everything. In medieval Ireland, feeding a guest wasn't just expected, it was legally mandated. The Brehon laws laid out not only that a host must feed their guest, but what they were expected to provide, depending on their rank, wealth, and social role. Forget tossing your guest a crust of bread and calling it a day. Irish hospitality was a ritual, and food was at its sacred centre. Let's start with the basics. A guest had to be offered food without grudge or delay. A cold welcome or obvious reluctance could be interpreted as dishonour, or worse, as a breach of law. The type of food and drink served wasn't random either. A chieftain or noble was expected to offer fine meals, roasted meats, milk, ale, and even mead if available. Their status demanded generosity. A farmer or lower-class freeman might serve oatcakes, butter, cheese, and curds. It didn't have to be lavish, but it had to be respectful. The Brehon laws even specified how the food should be served. Guests of equal or higher status were to be given the choicest portions, seated in places of honor near the hearth. You couldn't just dump a leg of mutton in front of a bard and call it generous. Presentation mattered. Symbolism mattered. Food was a performance of status and respect. And of course, there was drink. Mead was the preferred celebratory drink, a honeyed liquor that symbolized abundance and festivity. Ale was more common and widely served. Offering a guest a horn of mead was like offering them your goodwill in liquid form. Refusing to offer drink, or offering poor quality ale to a distinguished visitor, was a subtle insult with legal consequences. Why such attention to detail? Because food was more than sustenance. It was social glue. A shared meal sealed alliances, ended feuds, and confirmed bonds between clans. Even the act of eating together signaled mutual trust. Once you shared a hearth and food, you were no longer strangers. And if a host failed to provide adequate nourishment, they could be fined under the law, or worse, satirized by a traveling poet. A poorly fed guest could legally challenge the host's honor, which in medieval Ireland could cost you land, livestock, and your place in society. So the next time someone offers you a plate of cheese and bread with a smile, just know, in early Ireland, that might have been the law talking. In medieval Ireland, once a traveller crossed your threshold, they weren't just a visitor. They became a temporary member of your household, cloaked in your legal protection. The Brehon laws made it crystal clear. To host someone was to accept responsibility for their well-being, safety, and dignity for the duration of their stay. And if something happened to them under your roof, physically, socially, or legally, that was on you. This wasn't a casual matter. Your home became their sanctuary. If the guest was fleeing enemies, the moment they entered your brúden, hospitality house, or home, their pursuers were obligated to halt. The sanctity of hospitality overrode even blood feuds, temporarily at least. The guest became a c0ncubine, a sacred guest, and attacking them under the host's protection was a legal offense, one that could lead to restitution or even full-blown clan retaliation. This protection extended beyond physical harm. Gossip, insult, and public shame were also prohibited. If your guest was mocked or dishonored under your roof, you could be fined. Not because you said the words, but because you failed to prevent it. The host's role was that of guardian, moderator, and provider. Their household, no matter how humble, became a temporary court of civility. Even the sleeping arrangements carried legal weight. A guest was to be given appropriate bedding, ideally near the fire in winter months. While a nobleman might enjoy a separate chamber, even a travelling craftsman was entitled to a clean straw bed and shelter from the elements. Letting a guest freeze or sleep among the animals was a punishable disgrace, unless the animals were better off than the humans, in which case that was a whole other legal discussion. The guest, for their part, was expected to behave with decorum. They weren't to insult the household, abuse the host's trust, or take anything without permission. But as long as they stayed within those bounds, they were, for all legal intents and purposes, inviolable. Any harm done to them while under a host's roof carried heavier consequences than if done out in the open. In a land where justice was personal and honor was currency, sheltering someone wasn't just about keeping them dry. It was about stepping into a sacred role, protector, provider, and temporary steward of peace in a world that didn't always offer it freely. In the poetic balance of the Brehon laws, hospitality was generous, but not infinite. Enter the three nights rule, one of the most practical and fascinating clauses in medieval Irish custom. This rule stated that a guest had the right to stay under a host's protection for 3 nights, no more, no less, before their legal status changed. After that, they weren't just a guest, they were a problem. 3 nights. That was the legal line between honoured hospitality and social freeloading. During those 3 days, a host was expected to provide food, drink, shelter, and safety. They could not demand labour, payment, or service in return. But after that point, the guest became what's known in the legal texts as heir fortail, literally a burden of the household. At that point, the host was allowed to gently, or not so gently, nudge them toward the exit. Why 3 nights? Because it struck a delicate balance between generosity and sustainability. The Irish countryside was dotted with small settlements and family holdings. Resources weren't limitless, and hosting wasn't always convenient, especially in winter. By capping the legal hospitality period at 3 nights, the law ensured that hosts wouldn't be exploited and that guests wouldn't overstay their welcome. But even that expiration date came with nuance. If a guest was ill, injured or delayed due to storm or danger, the host was morally expected, and sometimes legally required, to extend shelter. The law always made room for compassion. However, once the guest had recovered or the weather cleared, the clock resumed ticking. Refusing to leave after the allotted time could lead to fines or humiliation. And if the guest caused trouble, say, insulted the household, damaged property, or refused to move on, they could be forcibly removed and shamed in court. The Brehon texts don't shy away from outlining exactly how unwanted guests could be dealt with, including restitution owed by the overstayer, or even compensation to the host for social embarrassment. This 3 nights rule gave structure to the unspoken social dance between traveller and host. It preserved dignity on both sides. The guest received what they needed without shame. The host gave freely without fear of exploitation. And when the third sunrise hit, it was time to pack up, say thank you and move on, hopefully with a full belly, a warm heart, and a blessing for the road. In medieval Ireland, there were no glowing tavern signs or roadside inns with jingling bells. Instead, hospitality was embedded directly into the infrastructure of society. Certain homes, called brúidne, plural of brúidin, were designated specifically for hosting travellers. These were the original hospitality houses, functioning like community-funded Airbnb long before the internet, or even surnames, existed. A brúidin wasn't just any house. It was usually run by someone of means, often a noble or wealthy freeman, who had a legal and social obligation to maintain it for the benefit of guests. These homes were known across the region, their reputations carried by word of mouth, song, and poem. They were a vital part of the social ecosystem, especially in a land with limited roads, unpredictable weather, and very long distances between settlements. Some brúidne were even semi-public buildings supported by a local lord or clan leader, intended to elevate the prestige of the territory. Hosting travellers, especially bards, monks, or political messengers, brought honour and influence. A well-maintained hospitality house was a sign of prosperity, good leadership, and moral character. And if you ran one poorly, people talked, and not in a good way. Inside, the brúidin followed the expected customs: fire lit, food offered, guest beds prepared. A guest was expected to be greeted properly, offered water for their hands and feet, and seated near the hearth. The better the guest's status, the more lavish the welcome. And don't think the hosts did all this for charity. Good hospitality paid back in reputation, alliances, and legal standing. In a land where everything depended on how you were seen by others, that mattered deeply. Interestingly, these homes weren't strictly religious. though monasteries also acted as hospitality centres, particularly for pilgrims or foreign guests. The Bruden system was secular, rooted in social obligation and legal tradition, not divine command. Hosting wasn't just for the pious. It was for everyone who wanted to be seen as honourable, or at least not sued for denying a poet a meal. The Bruden filled the role that hotels and rest stops play today, but with far more personal stakes. You didn't just stop there to sleep. You entered someone's legal and moral space. For 3 days, you shared fire, food, and protection. And for those 3 days, you weren't a stranger. You were a guest. And that meant everything. In medieval Ireland, violating the laws of hospitality didn't just risk legal fines. It risked something far worse: public ridicule by a professional poet. And make no mistake, a poet's insult wasn't just an awkward moment at dinner. It could ruin your life. In a society governed by honour, the sharpest weapon wasn't a sword. It was a stanza. Under the Brehon legal system, poets, fillid, held immense power. They weren't just entertainers. They were legal witnesses, oral historians, and cultural enforcers. Their words had weight, and their verses could build or destroy reputations. So when a poet arrived at your doorstep seeking shelter, turning them away was equivalent to stepping on a landmine. Socially, legally, and sometimes spiritually. This is where the infamous air comes in, the satirical poem or curse. If a host failed to offer proper food, lodging, or respect, a fillid could compose and recite an air targeted directly at them. These weren't random insults. They were finely crafted, memorable, and widely repeated. A well-placed air could spread through a clan like wildfire, turning your name into a punchline and your household into a cautionary tale. The belief was that satire had a supernatural edge. It wasn't just embarrassing, it could physically harm you. Some believed an air could bring disease, poverty, or divine disfavour. The Brehon texts even discuss legal consequences for satire used improperly. That's how serious the system took it. Satire was like a legal spell, and poets were its practitioners. This is why poets were so often greeted with such lavish care. You didn't just fear their power, you respected it. Hosting a bard well could bring long-term benefits. A glowing poem, favourable publicity, or your name woven into heroic tales. But neglect them, and your name might be immortalised in rhyme for all the wrong reasons. Poor hospitality, then, wasn't just a moral failure. It was an invitation to public shame. Your neighbours would hear about it. Your enemies would laugh about it. And your descendants might still be muttering apologies centuries later. In Ireland, words were weapons, and poets were feared as much as any warrior. So if you found a bard at your door, you'd best clear a space by the hearth and pour the mead fast. Because hospitality wasn't just a law, it was protection from poetry. By the end of the medieval period, Ireland had changed, politically, religiously, even linguistically. But the ancient customs of hospitality, so deeply woven into the Brehon laws, left behind a legacy that far outlived the legal system that birthed them. Even as English common law took root and the Gaelic order weakened, the Irish reputation for fierce, generous hospitality endured, not just as folklore, but as cultural identity. What made Irish hospitality so distinct wasn't just the food, or the fire, or the legal obligations. It was the idea that every person, no matter their origin, carried dignity simply by being a guest, that a stranger could be sacred. That offering shelter wasn't an inconvenience, but a declaration of personal honour. These weren't just laws, they were living ethics, taught around the hearth, recited in poems, and acted out in the muddy roads and thatched halls of a rugged, rain-soaked land. Even today, echoes of this ethos persist. The instinct to put the kettle on, to offer a guest tea and a seat before asking questions, remains a quiet echo of the Breton code. In rural villages, the unspoken rules of welcome still breathe through everyday gestures, offering bread without fuss, giving directions with a story, or ensuring no one leaves a home hungry. These aren't just quaint traditions. They're fragments of a legal and moral worldview older than most European states. The destruction of the native Irish legal system under English rule marked the end of the formal Breton tradition. But hospitality was harder to kill. It migrated into language, song, and behavior. It survived famine, colonization, and diaspora. Irish emigrants carried it abroad, to America, to Australia, to the corners of the world, where the stereotype of the welcoming Irish host took root and grew. In truth, medieval Irish hospitality laws were never just about comfort. They were about trust in a world without walls. They were about relationships, social glue, and survival. In a land of shifting alliances, harsh weather, and open roads, welcoming a stranger wasn't a risk. It was a necessity. And so, in the quiet offer of a warm fire, a soft bed, or a shared meal, we glimpse the soul of an ancient law, one that asked not just who you were, but how well you could welcome someone you'd never met.